Need help falling asleep? This calming bedtime story, with rain for relaxation, is your nightly escape. Like, subscribe, and drift off with cozy stories for sleep. What's your favorite time of day to press play on videos like this? The key turned with more resistance than I remembered. The metal was cold in my hand, worn smooth by decades of use, though my own fingers hadn't touched it in years. The door creaked open just enough for the scent to slip out, that earthy blend of old wood dust and something softer I couldn't name. Maybe lavender, maybe dried oranges. I hadn't expected it to smell like her. I stepped in slowly, like I was entering a memory instead of a house. The air felt heavy, not with sadness, but with stillness, like everything had taken a deep breath and never exhaled. Her chair by the window was exactly where it had always been. The blanket folded on the back of it, still crocheted, with those same sun-faded greens and yellows. I set my bag down without making a sound, as if noise might undo something delicate. I hadn't come for anything in particular. The house was being cleared out next month. A distant cousin had been handling the papers. I just wanted to see it one last time, to sit in the room where her voice used to live, to maybe remember what mine sounded like when I was small and safe and thought the world was shaped like summer afternoons and glass jars of strawberry jam. I walked to the back window, the one that faced the garden, and that's when I saw it. The rose, perfect, clean, blooming, as if she had just come in from watering them. Every single bed full. Marigolds, beans, kale, nasturtiums, cornflowers in bloom, and right there in the corner, the tomato vines curling up the trellis like they'd never stopped growing. But she'd been gone for 10 months. 10 months. No one had lived here since. No one had watered. No one had turned the soil or trimmed the edges or tied the stems. And yet, there it was, green, alive, orderly in a way that didn't feel wild but loved. I stepped outside, bare feet brushing the soft path of flat stones she'd laid one spring when I was 7. I knelt beside the parsley, full, fragrant, ready. I touched the soil, damp, as if it had rained just for her side of the fence. I looked up. The neighbors' yards were dry, yellowed, neglected. Only hers thrived. I sat there a long time, watching leaves shiver in a breeze that barely touched my skin. The light was changing that gold that makes things feel like stories, not moments. I heard myself whisper, "You're still here." Not a question, not a wish, just truth. And I swear the time by the fence rustled like a quiet nod. I stayed until the stars came, unable to move, not out of fear or disbelief, but because I didn't want to break the spell. Somewhere between dirt and silence, I understood. Something she gave this place was still breathing. And maybe it wasn't about gardening at all. Maybe it was about what happens when you tend to something long enough that it learns how to live without you. I spent most of the next morning just walking from room to room, not searching for anything, just letting the place remember itself around me. The light fell in exactly the same way I remembered catching the edge of the mirror in the hallway, warming the floorboards near the kitchen door, flickering across the china cabinet glass, like it had done every quiet afternoon I spent here as a boy. Her presence wasn't loud. It didn't cling like a ghost or fill the space with grief. It just settled, like the smell of dry tea leaves or the curve of a chair that knows your shape. On the windowsill above the sink, I found 6 small jars, each with a different kind of seed, each labeled in her handwriting, soft, slanted, half cursive: peas, calendula, dill, spinach, cosmos, basil, all dated, each jar dusted but not forgotten. One of them was newer, the ink darker. March 12. That was only weeks before she passed. I held it carefully. She must have been preparing the garden right up until the end. I opened drawers aimlessly, not with purpose, just curiosity. Fingertips trailing over old teaspoons, napkin rings, rubber bands too dry to stretch. Then I opened the desk. Inside, neat compartments, old envelopes, paper clips, a single fountain pen wrapped in cloth. But beneath all that, a notebook, the same kind she always kept near the phone. Spiral-bound, wide-ruled, thin pages that made soft sounds when turned. This one was different, though. No grocery lists, no call logs, just questions, one per page, all written in the same ink, in the same hand. I flipped gently. What grew the slowest this season? Another page. What was planted too early? Then, what didn't make it? Page after page, she wasn't just tracking plants. She was tracking herself. Through them. Through what lived, what didn't. What waited, what rushed. I read on. What did I neglect? What surprised me? What came back without asking? The questions weren't for anyone but her, but as I read them, they unfolded inside me like soft roots. She hadn't just been gardening. She'd been paying attention to the rhythm of things, to time, to herself. There was a page near the end that made me pause. It said, "If I'm not here next spring, what will come anyway?" I read it 3 times, not because I didn't understand, but because it was the truest thing I'd ever read. That afternoon, I sat in the garden again. I didn't bring anything with me. No tools, no gloves. I didn't water. I didn't prune. I just sat. And slowly, I began to notice things I'd never known how to see before. Which plants leaned toward which light? Which ones shared their shade? Which herbs protected each other from the wind? It wasn't magic, it was memory. In soil, in air, in attention. Her attention, still here, long after her hands were not. The rain came suddenly, but gently, the kind of summer rain that doesn't rush or roar, but arrives like someone who knocks once on the door and lets themselves in. I didn't move from the porch, just pulled the old wool throw over my shoulders and watched as the garden drank. The drops hit the leaves in soft rhythms, pattering over petals and bouncing off tomatoes with a music that didn't seem random. Everything shimmered, not wet, just alive. And then something shifted. Maybe it was the angle I was sitting at, or the way the rain darkened the soil in uneven patches. Or maybe I'd finally grown still enough to see what had always been there. Because suddenly, I noticed it. The flowers weren't random. The beds weren't just practical. They were placed deliberately. The marigolds curved along the left side, trailing in a gentle crescent. The lavender patches mirrored it across the path. Between them, a ribbon of bluebells followed a winding line, not quite straight, not quite chaotic. And from above, or in just the right slant of light, it all formed something, a shape, a word. I squinted, stood, stepped slowly onto the path, rain beating softly in my hair. From the porch, I couldn't quite see it, but now, walking between the rows, turning with the curve of each bed, I began to feel the pull of it. It wasn't a letter. Not exactly, but the shape was intentional. A gesture, a symbol only a garden would understand. It was something like a spiral, but not closed like an open hand turning toward the sky. I stood at the center of it, and it felt like standing inside a sentence she had written in living color. I smiled without meaning to, because of course she'd do this. Of course, her goodbye wouldn't be a note or a letter or some final voice message on an answering machine. She'd plant it, let it bloom, let it shift and stretch each season, just a little, just enough to say, I'm still here, but you're ready. I sat down on the edge of the path, wet now, but not cold. And for the first time in months, maybe longer, I didn't feel like something had ended. I felt like something was still speaking, not loudly, not to everyone, just to whoever was quiet enough to hear it. The rain slowed, then stopped. The garden glistened in the hush that follows rainfall, that deep, soft silence where everything is still listening. And I whispered, thank you, not to the sky, not to the dirt, just to the space she left open. And it answered me not in words, but in color, in breath, in bloom. I hadn't planned to sleep there again. The plan, if there ever really was one, was to visit, to remember, and to leave quietly. But when evening fell, and the house folded itself back into shadow, I found I couldn't walk away from the stillness. Not yet. I made tea, weak and fragrant, using one of the older bags I'd found near the stove. The water tasted of copper and thyme, but it didn't matter. I lit one small lamp in the corner of the living room, the one with the rose print shade, and curled up on the sofa she used to nap on. Rain tapped once again against the windows. Lighter this time, like the rhythm of fingers on a tabletop. I closed my eyes. Sleep came slowly, like fog seeping in under a door. And in it, I dreamed. Not of her, not of memories, but of the garden. I was standing in the center again, but it was early morning, the kind of light that doesn't have a color yet. Everything was still, not silent, but holding breath. And then, though no voice spoke, something pressed into my chest, like a whisper that bypassed ears entirely. A question. Not in words, not exactly, but I felt it like warmth. What will you tend now? That was it. That was all. Not will you stay? Not will you keep the garden? Not do you miss me? Just what will you tend now? I didn't answer in the dream. I don't think I could have. But I woke with the question still lodged gently in my chest, like a seed under the ribs. The room was quiet. No wind, no ticking clock, just breath. Mine, steady, present. I sat up slowly, the blanket fallen to the floor, the teacup still warm beside me, and I realized she hadn't asked for anything. She hadn't left behind a task. She left space for me to ask myself what mattered now, not then, not to her, but to the me that had walked back into this place, older, worn differently, and still looking for something to carry forward. I stepped out to the garden again, barefoot this time, letting the damp soil meet me without apology. Everything glistened, everything waited, and I knew the answer wouldn't come all at once. Tending isn't an act, it's a practice, a way of being. And maybe the garden didn't need me, but maybe something else in the world did. Maybe someone, or maybe just a small piece of myself. Something I'd stopped watering long ago. And so I whispered to the quiet, "I'll find out, I promise." And the garden, in its usual way, said nothing. But something in the way the light touched the parsley told me that was enough. It was the sound of bees that brought the memory back. Soft, steady, patient. Not the frantic buzzing of panic or urgency, but the hum of something that knows exactly what it's doing. I was sitting by the nasturtiums, watching one particularly round bee dip into a bloom and then pause, as if it too was remembering something. And just like that, I saw it that summer afternoon, sun warm and distant, when I was maybe 6, maybe 7. I had picked a flower, I think it was a violet, and I ran to her, proud, holding it out like a trophy. "For you," I said. She took it with both hands, knelt down, smiled gently, and said something I hadn't thought about in years. "Thank you," she whispered. "But next time, leave it where it grows. That way it can keep blooming, even when you're not watching." I remember being confused. It was just a flower, and wasn't giving it to her the point? But she didn't explain further. She just tucked it into her book, gently, like a secret. And now, decades later, that single sentence rang louder than anything else I'd ever learned in this garden. Leave it where it grows. I looked around at the kale, the beans, the tall, proud cosmos with their arms open to the sky, and I realized she hadn't just taught me how to plant. She'd taught me how to witness, how to let something exist without needing to own it, without needing to pluck it from the earth to prove you saw it. I sat there for a long time, knees in the dirt, remembering the shape of her hands, the way she never rushed when she walked the garden, how she paused at each corner, not to inspect, but to acknowledge, as if the garden wasn't something she worked on, but something she was in conversation with. And I thought about all the people I'd pulled too quickly from the soil of my life, all the moments I'd tried to preserve by holding too tight. How many things had I taken when all they needed was to be witnessed, gently, silently, fully. The wind picked up then, brushing my hair back from my face. And I swear, just for a moment, I could feel her hand on my shoulder. Not heavy, not even really there, but the way memory sometimes becomes touch when you're quiet enough. I whispered, "I saw it this time," and the nasturtiums shivered in what might have been a breeze, or a nod, or nothing at all. But I knew. The for sale sign had been leaning against the porch railing for days. It wasn't planted in the yard yet, just resting there, quiet and undecided. I kept telling myself I'd put it up tomorrow. That was the plan. The paperwork was ready. The calls had been made. But each morning I'd wake up, walk past the window, see the garden, and feel something tighten in my chest. Not grief, not regret, just pause. Like the house was waiting for me to be sure, and I wasn't. Not yet. That afternoon, I saw her again. The girl from next door, maybe 8, maybe 9, standing just outside the fence, fingers wrapped around the wire, peeking in. She wasn't doing anything, just watching. I opened the back door slowly so I wouldn't startle her. "You like gardens?" I asked. She blinked, startled, but didn't run, just nodded. "My grandma used to plant daffodils," she said, "but ours don't come back anymore." I nodded. "Sometimes they need rest." She looked down at her shoes. "Yours looks like it remembers everything." That stopped me. I smiled. "Maybe it does." I paused. "Would you like to see it up close?" Her eyes widened. "I can't. It's not mine." I shook my head gently. "It doesn't belong to anyone. Not really. But if you come in quiet and stay soft, maybe it'll show you something." She stepped forward like someone entering a church, cautious, reverent. Her hands hovered near the tall herbs, but she didn't touch, just looked. Slowly, step by step, we walked the rows. I didn't say much, just watched her face shift from curiosity to wonder to something like stillness. She crouched beside the lavender. "It smells like hugs," I laughed softly. "Yeah," I said, "it does." When we finished the loop, she looked up at me. "Can I come back sometime?" I nodded. "Whenever you want. Just be gentle. It listens." She ran back to her yard, quiet at first, then skipping like she didn't know her feet could be that light. That night, I took the for sale sign and slid it behind the shed. Not forever, but for now. The garden didn't need me to stay. It didn't beg for caretaking or attention. But maybe, just maybe, someone else did. Someone who needed to walk between quiet rows and feel something living that asked for nothing. The next afternoon, another child came. A boy this time. I didn't know him. He stood at the gate. I opened it. No words. Just a nod, and again he walked the path, slow and careful. A week later, someone left a folded note on the porch. "Thank you. I needed the quiet." No name, no signature, just that. And I realized this place was hers. But its stillness, its gentleness, didn't end with her. It was still working, still softening the world, one person at a time. The notebook wasn't intentional at first. Just a spare one I found in the drawer beside the sink floral cover, half used. Some recipes scribbled on the first few pages in a hand I didn't recognize. But it felt right to hold a pen in that garden again. Not to plan, not to track sprouts or soil conditions or rainfall, just to remember. The people, the way they arrived, the way they stood, the things they didn't say. On the first page I wrote, "Little girl, red shoes, asked if bees know when you're afraid. Told her they probably do." She smiled, didn't look afraid anymore. On the next, teenager, tall, didn't speak. Walked the path twice. Left a flower on the gate. Not from this garden, from somewhere else. I didn't share the pages with anyone. Didn't intend to. It wasn't a log. It was a practice. A way to stay awake. A way to listen. Some visitors came once and never again. Others returned weekly, some alone, some in pairs. Sometimes a grandparent held a child's hand like it was something fragile and ancient. Sometimes a man would walk in with his shoulders high and leave with them just a little lower. They never stayed long. That was the magic of it. The garden didn't keep anyone. It just received them softly. And in the evenings, when I sat with a mug of tea and the quiet, I would reread the day's entries, not for analysis, just for presence, just to feel the thread that was quietly weaving between them all. The garden had become something else. Not a sanctuary, that word felt too big, too heavy. More like a pause, a green breath in the middle of everything else. One day, an elderly woman came with a scarf tied around her hair and a notebook of her own. She didn't speak a word, just nodded once as I opened the gate. She walked directly to the time, knelt, and began to hum. A low, familiar tune. I didn't recognize it, but something in the dirt seemed to. She stayed a long time, and when she left, she touched my shoulder lightly and whispered, "She planted this for more than herself. You know that now, don't you?" I nodded, too choked to speak. And when she disappeared down the sidewalk, I wrote, "She knew." And I realized I wasn't tending a garden. I was tending the space she had created for people to come undone gently. And perhaps that was what she had been doing all along. Not growing things, but softening them. Starting with herself. Years passed, but the garden never asked for anything more than it always had. Space, softness, patience. Seasons changed. Flowers rotated. The soil told me when it needed rest, and I listened. Not as she had, not with her fluency, but with growing care. People still came, not as many as before, just enough to keep the paths pressed down by gentle feet, enough for a new story to find the old air. Children who once tiptoed between the beans now brought their own, smaller hands trailing behind them. Some visitors brought seeds, some brought silence. Most brought nothing and left with something they didn't have a name for. The notebook grew heavier, its pages full. I started another, then another. Never read them again. That wasn't the point. Writing was just how I noticed. The garden taught me that. One warm spring morning, one of those mornings where the breeze itself seems content just to exist, a small boy sat cross-legged beside the parsley, watching bees. A woman, maybe his mother, lingered at the gate. She didn't enter. She just watched. And then, under her breath, not to me, not even to him, but to herself, she asked, "Who is that man?" The boy looked up, shaded his eyes, and said simply, "He's the one who lets the plants talk, if you're quiet enough." And I smiled. Not because he was right, not because I had become something, but because I finally understood I didn't need to be remembered by name. She hadn't been. Not really. Her name wasn't carved anywhere in wood, not on a sign, not in stone, but she was everywhere. In the way the thyme leaned into the breeze, in the way lavender bent but never broke, in the way marigolds refused to stop blooming, even long after their time. And maybe that was enough, to leave something that speaks, even when you don't, to build something that doesn't need your hand to keep going. The garden would outlive me. It already had her. And someday, someone else would notice the spiral in the flower beds, the quiet in the soil, and they'd think it was magic. But I'd know it was just attention, the gentlest kind, the kind that teaches you. Everything we tend, even in silence, tends to us in return.